Okay. So welcome to the September 7 meeting of the Kubernetes or the CNCF IoT Edge working group. We pressed record a little late. We missed a discussion on the potential of having joint meetings with the Eclipse Edge group, but we're moving on now to discussing the Edge Native Principles white paper. So I think last time I kind of drove this discussion, but in the interest of getting some maybe diverse approaches to this, maybe if there's a volunteer, I'll hand off to drive this discussion to somebody else this meeting. Does anybody want to volunteer? If not, I'm about to nominate somebody. So if you're on the edge, speak up. I'm going to just go look for the first comment I see, and I think it's you, Kate. Would you mind taking over as moderator? Okay.
I didn't know if we wanted to spread it even further, but that is totally fine with me. Okay, great. I will share my screen then. Do you mind giving me host access as well?
I think I just did.
Perfect. Yes, you did. Awesome. Great. Can everyone, are people seeing the working group meeting notes or I think I shared the wrong.
Too many screens.
I know, a lot of tabs there. Okay, I think we're there. So in the past, what we've done when doing this is kind of look through comments and resolve them and then continue where we kind of left off as a group. I think we can continue with that flow and see if there's been any new ones. Our last meeting was on the 28th, I believe. So let's see if there are any since the last meeting. I don't think we have any new threads. So with that being said, we left off, I believe, around, we were discussing, so okay, to recap where we left off last time, we are going through the principles themselves, starting off by kind of narrowing down our definition and description of the principle. And we kind of bottlenecked at management at scale with a discussion around, is management at scale already captured between centrally observable and declarative orchestration? And I believe we tabled the decision of whether to keep management at scale to once we've kind of fleshed out the other principles. Please correct me if I'm wrong, anyone there. And then we looked at centrally observable. So with centrally observable, let's see if we finish that one off. At scale vendor agnostic monitoring techniques. So yeah, I think we're at centrally observable. I think we can continue to nail this down even more. How do people feel about this definition of centrally observable capturing all that we want?
The part you highlighted in blue, I think that there's a couple components of observability that normally I see in the category, and one is metrics, which would be the Prometheus we've got there, but the other is logs. And since it doesn't call out logs, I think that maybe this could be made a little stronger here in terms of, you know, if you want to go there and try to itemize the category of observability.
Fluentd is logs, correct?
Well, Fluentd can be used to transport logs, but
okay.
it's I'd say it's a component, you know, and something, the so-called, the first version was the elk stack, where Logstash was the thing that captured the logs. With Kubernetes, Fluentd and FluentBit are lighter weight and a lot more popular by my observation. but it fills a niche of transport of the logs, but it doesn't do, say, search or analytics of the logs or a UI for actually utilizing and taking maximum advantages out of a search capability. So it's a building block. I'd be hesitant to, if we wanted to start calling out actual components, that could be a pretty long list. I've nothing against it. If I don't think we can possibly list everything out there in the category. So if we were to start it, I'd say CNCF projects only that fall into the observability category.
Yeah, and I don't know if we need to, in description, be calling out projects.
Yeah.
I feel like description is that one sentence that someone reads out of context and lives forever. And these projects may not live forever. They may not be the established default for metrics or logging forever. So I think maybe, like, for example in this one, I think we were going to move this out into kind of paragraph section about it later if we have that.
Okay.
So
Can we record these things? Like, since you highlighted that,
Yeah.
just make it a comment and say plan is to move this out, and that we will.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think let's keep the description only.
Yeah. So in getting back to observability, I think it's fair to call out that this involves metrics, logs, and there might even be some other categories. So Kate, you're an authority on this more than I am, but for example, making edge devices observable could arguably be part of this category. So the whole idea of device twins might actually, if you wanted to put it in a category we already have, maybe this is the one it belongs in, right? Or do you think it's maybe a different one?
no, I agree, but this once again gets to our question of the intersection between observation and management. Because, which I think is an interesting part of whether we need that management section, is because digital twins are both. It gives you state and lets you declare state. So I think it's a little tricky. But I think that is fair to put that in observable. Like, I think there is a management component to observability potentially.
Okay, so how about if
Well,
we
you can't manage if you can't observe. So one is a building block for the other.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. Let's call that out. I like that statement. Observability is a building block or a precursor to management. And
Yeah, I can grant you a license to that one.
is it in your book?
I wish, because now I could hold the copyright on the phrase.
And then let's call out, how about something like categories include metrics, logging, and the monitoring aspect of device twins?
And would events and alarms, is that a separate category or is that part of metrics?
So alerting, that's, yeah.
Alerting, yeah, alerting.
And I think once again, we should circle back to what is edge native about this? Like, what do we have to add with this principle? Because I think that's really what to focus on in general. Anytime we get to a long list, is we're trying to help edge native developers.
Yeah, and I think what comes to mind is the scale, managing the scale. And then, you don't want like 1 million dashboards, sort of bubbling it up to something that a management system or a human being can actually consume.
I think what's different from traditional cloud native is that the pipeline of these things that you're observing is tolerant of being interrupted. So in other words, you've got queuing aspects here that you wouldn't typically find in a traditional cloud native public cloud hosted data center situation. It's tolerant of low and intermittent bandwidth as the transport. So the observability is going to tend to use different transport mechanisms. Now, it could be that in one of these principles, we've sort of covered, the connectivity aspect in another row, but I'm not sure. Let me go open this up in my own browser so I can scroll it.
So it sounds like we're trying to, one thing we're trying to get to here is what is unique is the scale and variety of what you're observing is to a further extent, and therefore makes central observability more important because there's so much more to capture.
Yeah, the other thing is, I think that because no person is typically no person is there to take observations of certain forms of state. It maybe observability is of more value, not less, when compared to the public cloud.
Right, you don't have people who are walking through data centers, checking on machines. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, or even have the option to, like, hey, I haven't
Yeah.
even heard from this thing. And it could be, sadly enough, at an edge situation, it could be literally the device is gone, like somebody stole it. And that isn't going to be a common scenario, hopefully, in your public cloud data center. The other thing is that there are really a lot of these observability things, both logging in particular, have security issues. And it isn't uncommon for those things to use people to, whether they should is debatable. But I think there are many people who are leaving those relatively open in terms of transport, feeling that, if it's in the data center, it's a secure, trusted environment. So there aren't so many worries about it. But, if you've ever had the experience of going to like Black Hat conferences, one of the first things somebody would do if they managed to land in a protected enclave is go try to find the log server, because you can go to one central point and get a lot of information. I mean, the key word here is centrally. So this becomes, a supreme, a valuable target. And I think in an edge scenario, maybe you've got to up your game when you operate observability to make sure that you're running this, with all the maximum security switches flipped on.
So I think maybe we can split the description into two. One is what's different: scale, lack of reliable connectivity, lack of manpower, and then what it means. It means more need for centralized management, a more reliable or a different type of a transport. It could also have implications on the architecture. You might actually have distributed observability. If there are certain aspects that are real time and critical, you might actually observe them at the edge and handle them at the edge. While this is a sort of a concept that's kicked around in LFN, is you have the concept of closed loops and open loops. So open loops means you observe them in a dashboard or a screen. Closed loop means the observed metrics or logs or events trigger and management or orchestration action automatically. And you can have this, of course, the open loop is only centralized, but the closed loop could be distributed. So you could have real-time observability and response to those observations at the edge or central. And then open loop, of course, is central. So I think maybe that would be a useful way to deal with it, is first describe what's different or what are the attributes, and then what it implies from a technical point of view. And then we leave out specific projects, at least for now. Maybe we cover them in a later section or something.
Yeah, certainly if we have a tech section, perhaps we can have links to other projects or even a link just to the CNCF landscape document. There, I think there's already a quadrant for some of the stuff, but I agree with that. And I love that closed loop versus open loop addition too.
Yeah, so I like that idea of focus in this definition, try to name the attributes without it becoming an insanely long list. And then also try to summarize some of the actions that results in.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can come up with a couple sentences based off of that.
Hey, Kate, is the closed loop, open loop, would that be part of orchestration? It should be the next road down. So it's what was just said, the separation. At first, we were talking about the observability, and then now we get into, okay, you observe, what do you do? And that is the orchestration.
I don't think it is. You know, orchestration as typically treated in Kubernetes is the placement of your app workloads. And Kubernetes also has a concept called controllers or operators, which are the control loops that operate on your declarations of desired intent. And those are considered to be separate from orchestration. So I think that this open, you know, the open and closed loop is more in the operator category or controller category if Kubernetes was to drive these loops. But Amar, why? I see you nodding your head, but you're the one who brought up the concept. So maybe if you've got remarks.
So closed loops straddle observability, management, and orchestration, because the action of a closed loop could trigger configuration management, lifecycle management, or orchestration. However, if I had to, you can't put it in all three. If I had to say which does it have the strongest affinity to, I think it's observability. I would probably put it there. And open loop is only observability. It has, it doesn't really relate to management. I mean, human beings use that to then manage and orchestrate, but again, I'd probably put it in observability.
So, Amar Prakash here.
Oh, hey.
Hey, so I would like to add that liveliness of a particular CNF is important. So whether it is alive, so observability contributing to local awareness of a CNF being live is important, because we generally check heartbeat, etc. So I would put that observability, as Amar mentioned, has all components, either of control or monitoring or for, but more importantly for the survival of that CNF in the local context is very important.
Do you think we should throw health monitoring in there as a category along with metrics, logging, etc.?
Yes, I believe so. The liveliness as well as the heartbeat, both.
I think health, yeah, I think health would cover both.
Okay, I think we made good progress on this row. Kate, if you wouldn't mind, since you're editing, maybe just delete right now the Prometheus FluentD links, since we discussed that maybe we don't want to go into the details of specific projects here. Good.
I think we're still a little bit away from how to summarize this.
I think it's okay if we have the comment there that if anyone who wants to can come back in, you know, within the next week and make an attempt at cleaning this up along the lines of what was discussed here. I know I, for one, if I'm writing, I need a little more think time and stuff to go put the things down, maybe even in a separate notepad before I'm happy that it reads nicely. And I'm not prepared to come up with my best work on the fly during a Zoom meeting. or Frederick, you're the author on this. What's your suggested technique for coming out with production ready text here?
Oh gosh.
You know,
Well-
you brag about your book, we're going to hold you. We're going to expect a demonstration of your wizardry.
Oh gosh, yeah. The technique, I think, is essentially what you are doing, right? You put it in a verbose way, and then you try to make an actual sentence, or something you would put on a slide with it. If it was the big point that you're trying to make about something, at least for me it worked pretty well as a technique. But of course, this has a tendency to lead to loss of nuance, so to speak. So you need to be careful about that. But I would recommend maybe keep your column with the full verbose version, and maybe create a third one in the table that would be the synthesized version, and try to actually synthesize in one sentence or two what's there.
Yeah, that makes sense to have kind of capture the notes.
Yeah, you don't want to lose them, because that's your collective wisdom, so to speak.
Well, and to that point, right, it's like capturing the notes. It's almost like we have enough to write the paragraph, because writing a description for what's going to be a paragraph is going to be harder. You got to summarize something that's not written, and we're inevitably kind of getting into the details beyond the scope of a description. But we want to capture those, because that becomes part of the paper. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, I think as a placeholder,
That's Frederick, where you were going, I believe.
Excuse me?
I think that's where you were going. Capture the notes, because we may find that useful later. So
yeah. I think for now the notes on the side work, but eventually you close them and they disappear. Maybe we can leave them as notes because they're easy to find while we're still discussing, and perhaps convert them to footnotes or something later that are still linked to a section.
Yeah, or in documents that we worked on in our group, what we did is that we had a section of raw materials at the end, where all of those brainstorming sessions or notes or things like that weren't ready for prime time, or just accumulated in case we want to refer to them. That's another way to do it. But then maybe you lose the link to the actual context in the document that you get with the comment. You muted yourself.
You threw out the idea of adding a third column, but my reluctance there is that they get so narrow that you can't easily read them all if we put a third column there.
And then you can switch to landscape mode, but then that's another type of problem. I mean, there's no elegant solution to this. So Google, build something better.
I think the one benefit of trying to nail down a definition is it's hard, and might point out the fact that a category is too broad. I'm wondering this with centrally observable, whether there's two things going on. We have observability, and then we also have monitoring, and I'm wondering if those should be separated, or if we need to get even broader and say like a central hub, like a location for observation, monitoring, and state reconciliation, because if it's almost like we need to keep breaking it down smaller or get bigger is what I'm curious about.
Yeah, I think that some of the things thrown out here would lead me to believe that instead of splitting this, we do need to keep it together. And a couple aspects of that are that we want to point out what's different here when it's destined for edge versus a centralized public cloud, traditional cloud native. And this aspect related to observability of the precarious nature of the transport of all of this stuff is, I think, the key thing leading to the difference between traditional cloud native. And it spans all of these aspects of observability, you know, logs, metrics, etc. So if we want to call out the differences between traditional and edge native, I think keeping it together is useful. The other aspect of why you brought up this idea of is it all about hoisting this up to a central location? But the idea that was brought up of the open and closed loop implies that in some scenarios, it isn't all about central, that you would want to have the closed loop reaction to some of these. Maybe if it isn't at the edge itself, it might be at a mezzanine tier that is below the top tier where the management takes place. You know, so in other words, maybe a physical site at an edge location has 4 independent devices and either a regional or a localized place to host control loops. And you'd have a tiered architecture for these control loops. So I don't know, I kind of like it the way it is now. That would be my vote.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is centrally observable is the most important part for edge native applications, because the orchestration and management and state reconciliation can happen in various parts and locations. But there needs to be some way to observe what's happening centrally. So I think that makes sense to call that out as the the principle, and then put in that what we're observing is all of this that's happening.
Yeah, in the table, I think we, you know, right in the column itself, as opposed to the column, I think we need to call out the differences between traditional cloud native. And I think I'm trying it, you know, just at the seat of my pants, coming up with what the crux of that difference is. And I think it's support for async data collection. Maybe somebody can come up with a better term for that, but the idea meaning that you can't expect that you've got synchronous capture of all this observability data 24/7.
I mean, I think differences in my mind boil down to 3, right? The scale, the transport, which is, you know, less reliable and whatever we want to call it, and constrained manpower, or maybe in some cases lack of manpower, constrained, or constraint is good enough. I think those 3. I mean, I don't know if there are any others. Those
and don't use the term manpower, because the project overall has a stated policy against that.
Okay, yeah.
Staff.
Constrained
staff. How staff.
Constrained IT ops staff or something, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, and that leads to security, async, what we were just talking about. It leads to distributed and central architectures, closed loops, open loops. All of these are a result of these 3 things, I believe.
There's one thing that hasn't been highlighted. I'm not sure if it fits there, but typically, especially if you have very important edge infrastructure, you will have some sort of out of band connectivity to be able to troubleshoot outside the regular channel if something happens or something. And that's something that you don't see typically in cloud, right? So is that something that should be surfaced somewhere?
Actually, I think you do. And here's the scenario. If you're running your own cloud, you know, like an on-prem based on, I don't know, it is my employer, but vSphere, you would typically have things like, you know, on Dell hardware, it's iDRAX, on HP, it's iLO, where you can get to hardware out of band for management, IPMI, things like that. Now, the cloud providers have those. They just don't give it to you as a tenant, but they do have out of band management of the servers and things that are going on in these public clouds. They're just not, because of the security issues they hold the keys to it and they don't give it to you as a tenant, but they are there.
Yeah, for sure. But from an application developer perspective, it doesn't matter that they are there since you don't have access to them, right?
Yeah,
Whether
I mean, even
at the edge, you want to take that into account because that's even it's that's not necessarily your device, but you may have a need to, let's say, restart all of those nodes that would be on those locomotives for whatever reason, right?
yeah, kind of your anti-brick insurance, if you will, and the recognition that at edge a truck roll is more expensive than inside of data center. The reaction would be send a human there with the so-called crash cart to hook up the monitor and keyboard, figure out what went on.
Yeah, and I think that one fits under management if we keep that principle.
Yeah, sorry. So I brought you on a little detour there. Sorry about that.
No, but I think it's a good point because we were considering whether or not that was one to keep. I also think it gets us back to a question we had a while ago when talking about this paper is this about the infrastructure and how we manage the infrastructure, or is this about how we manage the application? Are those the same thing?
Yeah.
But when we talk about like node management, that gets to possibly a different category than talking about application. I don't know, but the scope's hard to nail down there.
Yeah, I actually suggest, I'm leaning now towards we were almost killed management, but I think maybe we keep it. But since we, in the row below, we called out that observability is a precursor to management, we should probably move management one row below if you can do that. Just so people read them in the preferred order. Good.
And if you're looking for opportunities to collapse, maybe management and orchestration could be collapsed, because orchestration is nothing but management at day zero.
Yeah, or management of apps as opposed to other things. One of the interesting remarks that somebody made talking about management too was the infrastructure aspect. And I would contend at Edge that a vastly larger number of people need to concern themselves with infrastructure management because you own the problem. If you choose to outsource to a large public cloud provider, kind of the infrastructure is something you threw over the fence to outsource to somebody else. But your options at Edge for doing that are pretty limited. I've heard that there are some attempts by people like Amazon to maybe offer a paid service where you can hire a vendor to take care of that, but still somebody is doing it. Managing that infrastructure didn't magically disappear from the planet, into true virtualization. They're physical things that can break and need maintenance, and somebody's got to do it. And I think that it's easier to ignore that in traditional cloud native than it is at Edge native.
I think that's a really good point. And we are seeing that in the Nefio community, where Nefio's goal is infrastructure and application. So they use the term deployment instead of orchestration, deployment and management of heterogeneous cloud/edge infrastructure and network services. There's nothing preventing applications. So I think that's an important point. And even if your node itself is managed, let's say you take AWS Outposts or something else where the node is managed, or a Equinix Metal, still composing an edge infrastructure that constitutes of compute, storage, networking, a CAS layer, all the plugins that have to go into the CAS layer like Istio, Prometheus, CNIs, any operators that have to deal with SRIOV, DPUs, GPUs. That is, somebody has to do that. So even if you say that I don't want to deal with the BMC and the IPMI firmware and the BIOS and the operating system, there's still a lot of infra management that you as the user or a managed service provider on behalf of the user has to do. So I think addressing infrastructure and applications is important. And the CAS layer, the Kubernetes layer, and the various plugins we could lump with the infra. So we don't need an infra platform and application discussion, but I think infra and application are distinct and both are required. While exactly to Steve's point, in a cloud, you might almost, not even think about the infra part. I mean, you at some level, even there you do, if you want to spin up EC2 instances and EBS and put a load balancer and, static IP, and you still have to compose the infra, but often you don't even think about it. It's so easy and trivial.
Yeah, the other aspect of management, I'm debating where this belongs, but a big problem at Edge is onboarding. It's day two is where we focused most of this discussion this morning so far, but the onboarding thing is perhaps a tough challenge too, where FedEx delivered a box, you plug it in, you don't have any skilled staff there, yet you still need to bring this on the air so that it can be used as a trusted resource, even though you lack trusted people to trigger the process. And I think it falls under this management category, perhaps closer to infra than apps, because the onboarding is to get a platform ready that can host apps. But I think that device onboarding is very different in Edge versus traditional cloud native. And it needs to fall into either some row of this table, or we're missing a row in the table, because it's a key aspect that it needs to have a home.
So we're getting some good ideation going here. I think Frederick's point of having a notes column might be useful. Thoughts on me adding a notes column or using the same column and adding a notes section within this, like just a notes line.
Yeah, I think unless we flip to landscape, I don't like adding another column, because it's just going to be, you'd have to cut the width of this column in half. And
there is another
tough to
crude
do.
option. You can widen the table without making it landscape. So the table will stretch outside the
scroll.
page.
Okay.
Yeah.
But how would I print
Oh, maybe
it?
not. I'm mistaken. I thought it could.
Maybe in Word, but not sure you could do that.
Not in Google Docs.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear that these are notes, so we'll just keep them coming.
Okay.
But I'm not going to hold back from adding to it anymore.
So I think I think let's just keep my suggestion is let's just keep management one, as opposed to splitting infra and apps. And the reason I feel is that the paper is about, is it edge native or edge native application principles? Are we
Well, the
talking-
title right now says Edge Native Principles. I don't think we want to label the title as just apps, because that would really narrow the scope, and half the stuff we've
Okay.
talked about would fall out.
Then maybe it's worth splitting, because then I think it allows separate treatment of infra and apps.
I think we went with applications to deliberately narrow scope, potentially, when we were first discussing this, to avoid discussing the infrastructure concerns. So with an eye on application developers are deploying their apps on edge infrastructure, what do they need to keep in mind? But maybe that was too optimistic of a view, believing that the infrastructure and the application was decoupled might have been the learning that we just arrived at, is that there is no edge native application principle. Because you need to keep in mind the infrastructure.
My soapbox attitude is that just like Kubernetes itself, it advertises itself as this abstraction layer that allows you, the app developer, to have it easy and ignore all of these differences and difficulties at the layers below. And that holds true as long as things are working 100%. But as soon as something as soon as something malfunctions, all of a sudden, maybe every app developer doesn't need this skill set, but somebody in your organization has to at least be familiar with what's going on under the covers. Sort of the idea that you as the driver might be able to take an abstraction of steering wheel and gas pedal and brake, and that's all you need. But it's inevitable that at some point something is going to go wrong and some mechanic will have to get involved to open the hood. And you can't ignore the fact that there's things under the hood. So I think we've diverged already to start talking about what's under the hood here.
I think in Edge native, I think the applications are more sensitive in nature. The reason they're on the edge is they need lower latency or higher throughput or something of that sort. So I think for that reason, a developer at the edge does need to worry about the lower layers more than in a cloud context. So you do need to worry about GPUs and DPUs and SRIOV and FPGAs and other infra considerations, storage performance. So I think while in a cloud context, you might get away. I mean, it's a web application. It's, it doesn't matter to that degree. But in an edge, even an app developer, even if I think I'm sort of agreeing with your point, and Stephen, and sort of upping it one, even if an average app developer needs to know what's under the hood.
Yeah, you're right. And the other aspect of cloud with regard to that is if you ignore the things in a public cloud, the elasticity, the scalability can save your butt if you're willing to spend a bunch of more money to paper over a problem. Maybe you didn't do it efficiently, but if you did it half as efficiently as you could still live with it if you have horizontal scalability and are willing to throw money away. At edge, things just break because you can't get away with those inefficiencies. Same thing to cover up availability issues. If you've got the horizontal scalability and don't really care where something runs, you can cover up design issues, if you will. At edge, if your app is tied to IO that's only at one location, you have no options.
No.
So I think for now is the resolution. We talked about combining management with orchestration, but I think we're leaning more towards there's a justification for keeping them as two separate rows. And maybe just leave it at that for now.
Yeah.
They're certainly related and there's common aspects to both of these rows, but I think it maybe is justified to keep them as separate rows.
In that case, I think this vendor neutral pass is probably not applicable, potentially.
I think the point there is each application has its management tooling. So the question is that the best way? And if you have hundreds of applications, you're using hundreds of vendor provided tooling. Some manage one instance at a time, some manage a fleet of instances. Or do we want to go to a vendor neutral way to manage applications and infrastructure using techniques like Kubernetes and Nephew? Or, I mean, we wouldn't mention those names, but I'm just, so that I think I had originally introduced that thread, and that was my intent, that what are we recommending? Are we saying vendor provided tooling or vendor neutral methods?
Well, I think another issue here at edge that's different from cloud is that some of these aspects of the infrastructure become vendor specific just because we have hardware involved. And I don't think there are some initial attempts at so-called open hardware, things like the Raspberry Pi, where theoretically anybody can make these and they're published, reference architectures. but that hasn't become as widespread, as it has in software. So some of these are going to cross over to being vendor specific once you get down to the infrastructure. That's my contention.
I mean, that's true even on the application, but the question is, do we expect them to write operators, for example, and hide that vendor specific and then expose it to a vendor neutral paths? Or do we expect the user to, go all the way and manage like a GPU, for example, or an application, for example, just go to the GUI of that application and start managing it, right? That's at this scale, what do we want to recommend? And my feeling is I'm more in the sort of the Kubernetes Nefio declarative way of orchestrating and managing. I think that to me makes more sense. But if we don't want to take a strong stand, we could just not talk about it.
I think this is a good point, though. I think basically we're saying there's a lot going on. For example, device onboarding, you don't have as much horizontal scaling, you're more tied to certain infrastructure, and maybe we're putting a little bit of orchestration in here too. We're listing off the things that are of concern, but ideally, when you're making an edge native application, you find some vendor neutral paths that encapsulates all these issues for you. So maybe having something like saying that it's really important to continue the cloud paradigm of deferring this management to an entity so that you can focus and abstract away those details. I don't think that's a bad recommendation to make. I don't know if it should fall into principle, but I think that's interesting.
So I would say that, are we trying to just list what exists, or are we trying to steer it towards a best practice, what should be? And in either case, ignoring infrastructure in a constrained environment like Edge is not realistic. And so, Edge native, when we talk about 12-factor cloud native to Edge native, how is it different? In the sense what the constraints are, and therefore what we need to bring, whether vendor neutral or technology specific rather than vendor neutral, but we have to spell it out for the deployment model to be effective. Otherwise, at the architectural level, there is no problem. We can just talk about the whole thing, what exists. But when it comes to deployment models, we will be forced to look at what is edge native. So my take would be, we have to not narrow down to edge native application only, but we have to think about platform as well as the infrastructure as a way to build. And if we want Kubernetes as the key piece, because which is what is becoming the cloud, we can deal with that.
I think one thing that I got from that is kind of along with centrally observable, with observability being a precursor to management. We have here that good management is a precursor to deployment on the edge, because we are so tightly tied, because we do need to manage the infrastructure.
So one thing that's still on my mind based on what Prakash mentioned is, so if we broaden the scope of the paper, can we still keep the persona as the developer? So developer centric, it may not be just edge native application principles, but edge native principles from a developer's point of view, because I'm a little concerned if we go completely broad, then there are operational considerations. There are, I mean, there are just so many personas that get involved, and so many that it could become a very long paper. I don't know how people feel about constraining it to the developer persona.
I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would put that we have developers perspective as well as DevOps perspective. Two perspectives we'll have to take if we have to be able to recommend something that is deployable and with best practices. So the white paper size and all we can define, saying, okay, we are going to do only 20 pages or 40 pages beforehand. And
We were thinking like 6.
6 pages. Yeah,
maybe
so whatever.
8.
Yeah, maybe 8, 6, 8. So what we do is we can have all the discussions and all, but narrow it down with a abbreviation summary so that we can point if somebody is interested in looking at more details here. That way we can. Yeah. So to boil down to 6 and 8 is very hard. I would put it still. It's so then the question is, do we include DevOps perspective at all? Which is, we have to be able to express in brief both. That's
Yeah,
what
I think maybe starting with a broad overview that covers the whole landscape, and then even if to maintain 5 or 6 pages, really all we have are these tables, it's still useful to put the overview, and then we can have additional white papers down the road that cover developer perspective, ops perspective. Say, I had a thought that I left as a chat comment, but just kind of brainstorming here on this concept of, we got 2 rows, management at scale is the one that we've been discussing, and then we have declarative orchestration. But the thought occurred to me that maybe we can factor this to divide it under into 2 different categories. One I would call management of infrastructure and platform. And by infrastructure, I'm thinking more like physical devices, hardware, etc. And platform would be baseline fixtures that support applications but aren't applications themselves. So in other words, laying down an operating system, laying down a container runtime, maybe if you choose to run Kubernetes, it's laying down the Kubernetes worker node components. And management of that at scale is kind of the precursor that gets you in the position to manage apps. The reason the second title would be app management at scale is really, to me, orchestration is that traditional cloud native idea of, I have a centralized pool of servers where I could run things. I have a centralized queue of workloads, and I just randomly assign them to maximize efficiency. That is the traditional idea of orchestration, I believe, and that isn't really what goes on at Edge. They're more like one-to-one mappings. And I think just like we discussed when we touched on observability, there are aspects potentially where there are end tiers here going on, where these control loops might have a control loop that goes all the way up to the top cloud layer, but other localized control loops. I think when it comes to apps, it's a little different than the cloud native with regard to things even like container image registries. You know, really, container image registry in a large cloud could live with pulling it out of one central registry. But when you get to edge locations, often because of bandwidth constraints, you'd like to host a container image registry locally and have that set up as tiers where they could do lazy pulls when bandwidth is available from a more centralized tier, and you end up with those being hierarchical in nature. So the app management is potentially a lot more than just the orchestration of get this container running. It also includes this collateral things like caching image registries. So by calling that thing app management at scale, I think it's broader than just orchestration. And I don't know, that was my thought here.
I personally like that division. I think it's a reasonably large enough change for us to table that since we're at time, and maybe carry that on. I put them under there, under each of them. I think that's where you were looking at them, Steve. And then maybe we can pick up next time discussing, do we put all the infrastructure and platform concerns in one principle, which would help us because we can keep that small and focus on applications elsewhere, application developers. and then put the specifically, like you were saying, orchestration means application management and the cloud native context, put that in a separate section. But I think since we're over, it might be good to table that to next time. I can't hear you, Steve.
Okay, so let's recognize the time and call this to a close, but anybody who wants to follow up on this, since we're cutting off discussion, please just go put the comments down in the doc if you've got any comments you would make if we continued on for another 15 minutes. So thanks everybody for attending, and I think we've declared we're having supplemental meetings on a weekly schedule. So we're going to have a meeting 1 week from now just to discuss the document and not, the traditional full IoT Edge working group meeting. So next time.
All right. Bye, Steve.
Bye.